Welcome, dear listener. Tonight, let the world fall quiet around you and step gently into a story wrapped in candlelight and dust. This is not a tale of noise or fear, but of stillness, memory, and the kind of love that lingers behind locked doors. Come walk the winding corridors of a place long forgotten, and hear the hush of why the alchemist's room was never opened again. It always began with the scent of old lavender and paper faint and brittle, like the memory of a letter never sent. You remember it as clearly as the quiet that settled in the corridor, when the sun dipped low behind the hills and turned the stone walls to gold. The alchemist's room, tucked at the far end of the west wing where even the house's footsteps faded into silence, was never loud, never open, and never empty of wonder. You did not speak of it often. No one did. But still, the thought would rise unbidden, like mist over the garden after rain, the way the brass handle stayed untouched for years, and how the keyhole grew a little more clogged with dust each season. You had passed that door 100 times, perhaps more, always with a kind of inward hush, like a child passing a sleeping animal too large to understand. The wood of the door was dark, stained with something older than time, its carvings almost lost to the erosion of centuries. When you laid your hand on it once, just once, it was cooler than stone, as though the air behind it belonged to a place where sunlight had never quite been welcome. Your fingers had lingered there, drawn by a pull you couldn't name, a hum you couldn't hear with your ears, only feel in your bones, but you never turned the handle. No one did after the alchemist vanished. The room had belonged to him, though no one had ever dared to claim it after. He was not a man of warmth, nor of cruelty, but of quiet hours and strange-smelling fires. You remember the nights when faint trails of blue smoke curled from the chimney high above the west wing, twisting like ribbons into the star-soaked sky. Sometimes you would lie awake and imagine what he was mixing in there, what herbs, what dusts, what fragments of forgotten metals. The scent would sometimes drift into the halls, sharp as sage, soft as old roses, bitter like rainwater drawn from copper. Even now, the memory of it clings to you like the trace of incense on old robes. There were stories, of course, whispered by candlelight and half-remembered in the morning. They said he could change stone to silver, or turn a single drop of dew into a song that could make even the trees weep. Others spoke of stranger things, that he once bottled a shadow, or brewed a potion that let him speak with moths. But stories in that house always changed with the teller. What never changed was this: one morning, long after the stars had gone, he simply did not come out. You remember that morning as a stillness rather than an event. No shout, no clatter, no scream. Just the realization, around midday, that the hallway remained empty, that the alchemist had not taken his tea, nor opened his shutters. The servants exchanged glances, but said nothing. You, perhaps still too young to understand the weight of absence, had crept once more to the door and pressed your ear to the cold wood. No sound, not even breath. Someone placed a small wooden chair in front of the door later that week, as if to suggest it was watched, though no one ever sat in it. Dust collected gently in the folds of its woven seat. Spiders claimed the corners of the doorway, and still no one opened it. Not then, not ever. Seasons passed, and the house grew quieter. The west wing settled into a kind of sacred disuse, like a chapel left untouched by weather or worship. Windows clouded with webs. The vines outside curled toward the sill, as if reaching for something inside. You would walk past now and then, perhaps a little faster each time, the silence behind that door deepening not with menace, but with mysterious sense that whatever was inside had folded itself into sleep and ought not to be disturbed. It was not fear that kept the door closed, it was reverence, as if everyone, in their own way, understood that the room had become something other than a room. Not a tomb, not a prison, but a boundary, a quiet line between what is known and what should remain unknown. There was no key, or if there was, it had long since been lost, tucked in the lining of an old coat, or slipped behind the stones of the hearth. No one searched for it, no one tried. And so the alchemist's room became part of the house's hush, part of the rhythm of footsteps avoiding the west wing, part of the pattern of firelight casting long shadows on the far wall, but never daring to flicker that way. You would sit in the library sometimes, reading a book he once touched, his notes still in the margins, small, slanted letters that smelled faintly of rosemary and ink. You would trace the words with your finger, feeling as though he might walk in at any moment, nod once, and disappear again. But he never did. Even now, the house remembers him. If you walk past the west wing on a still night, you might hear the faint creak of a floorboard shifting under no one's weight, or catch the scent of cardamom and clove rising from nowhere, or see, just for a moment, a thin glimmer of light where there should be none, as if a candle had been lit behind the closed door, then quickly snuffed out again. But those are just remnants, the breath of a memory left too long in a sealed jar. The door remains closed, the chair is still there, and the alchemist's room, wrapped in silence and the weight of years, waits without waiting, dreams without dreaming. You pass it now only in thought, your steps muffled by time. It is not yours to open. It never was, and that is why, even after all this time, no one ever did. That is why the alchemist's room was never opened again. You remember the wall best in late spring, when the soft rains had passed, and the air hung warm and damp like a breath held between thoughts. The alchemist had a garden, though no one called it that, and it wasn't like the other gardens with orderly rows and trimmed hedges. This one lived in its own time, its own rhythm. It grew not in neat beds, but along the crumbling southern wall beneath his window, nestled between mossy stones and worn cobbles, where sun pooled gently in the mornings and moonlight spilled like silver milk at night. You can still feel the warmth of those stones beneath your fingers, the way they held the day's heat long into dusk, and how the scent of sage and thyme clung to your sleeves long after you had walked away. He never tended it like a gardener, never with spade or shears, but with an attentiveness you came to understand was quieter, more enduring. The plants responded to his presence in curious ways, basil that always leaned toward his shadow, violets that bloomed again when he walked past. You once saw a stalk of fennel quiver, even though the wind had stilled, and a row of marjoram release a deep resinous fragrance, just as he passed by in silence. You watched from the path sometimes, hidden behind the veil of elderberry leaves, listening to the delicate sound of glass vials clinking softly in his coat as he moved, careful not to disturb the moths nesting in the ivy. The herbs he gathered never left the garden hole. He took sprigs and snips, never roots, always with a kind of unspoken permission. Sometimes, after he vanished behind the door again, you would creep to the wall and find a clover folded like a letter, or a stalk bent gently as if nodding. Nothing ever appeared broken. Even the petals he took left no ragged edge. There was a reverence to the way he moved among the leaves and stems, as though the plants knew something you did not, and he was simply asking to listen. In late afternoons, when the bees had grown sleepy and the birds had hushed their songs to gentle whistles, you would lie in the grass near the wall and breathe in the mingling of 100 scents. There was lavender, soft and powdery, like the memory of linen tucked away in old cedar chests. There was rosemary, sharp and green, with a hint of lemon bark beneath its surface. Sometimes you smelled things you couldn't name, smoky, peppery, almost metallicant. You would close your eyes and wonder what he might be making with them. A draught to quiet dreams, a potion to soften grief, a tincture that held the echo of someone long gone. You never saw anyone else go near that part of the wall. The servants avoided it, pretending it was just a tumble of weeds. Even the cats skirted wide, though now and then one would sit a few feet off and stare at the alchemist's window with slow, blinking eyes, as if waiting for some signal you could not perceive. And though you never heard him speak to the plants or sing to the soil, there was a stillness that settled over the space when he was near, a breathless kind of reverence, as if even the wind held itself quiet out of respect. The day he disappeared, you remember noticing the change, not in the house first, but in the garden. It happened slowly, so gently that no one else seemed to notice. The herbs did not wither, they did not grow wild or vanish. They simply began to look, still, as though whatever motion had once passed between their roots and his fingertips had fallen silent. The basil no longer tilted its leaves toward the shadowed door. The rosemary gave off no scent when brushed. Even the violets, though still blooming, lost the shimmer they once held beneath moonlight. You returned there often in the days that followed, sitting on the same worn stone beneath the window, tracing the cracks in the wall with your fingers and listening for a sound that never came. The breeze moved through the leaves, but the garden felt empty, like a stage after the curtain falls. You reached out once to pluck a single sprig of mint, and though your touch was gentle, it snapped too easily, releasing a sharp, bruised scent that lingered bitterly on your hands. You did not try again. Over time, the garden began to blend into the background of the house's long memory. Other stories replaced the old ones. The wall was overtaken slowly by ivy and silence, and the plants that had once shimmered with unspoken conversation became just plants again. But you, even now, remember how it felt to lie among them when the world was hushed and the scent of the earth rose in waves through the warm stone. You remember the way the light fell through the high branches, broken into ribbons that danced across your skin like blessings. You remember the peace that came from simply being near something that lived without needing to be explained. And sometimes, though not often, you still dream of that wall. In the dream, the herbs are in bloom again, not just green and fragrant, but glowing faintly with some inner light, like stars too small to be seen in daylight. You see him there, not facing you, not speaking, but moving slowly with one hand outstretched, touching leaf after leaf, like a man reading a forgotten story, written in scent and shape. You wake with the taste of time on your tongue and the feeling that something important had nearly been understood. That is why the wall remains. No one has ever cleared it, nor rebuilt it, nor let it fall. It simply waits, growing older, softened by moss and memory. The alchemist's room may be sealed, But part of him still lingers there in the soil and the stones and the curve of rosemary reaching faintly toward an unseen hand. And that, perhaps more than anything else, is why the alchemist's room was never opened again. There was a cupboard just outside the alchemist's room, small and carved from a pale wood that had long since darkened with time, its hinges rusted to silence, and its corners smoothed by countless passings. It stood alone along the corridor wall, half forgotten by those who no longer paid attention to that wing, but never entirely unseen by you. You were drawn to it often, not with urgency or fear, but with a quiet kind of curiosity, the way one might be drawn to a ripple in a still pond, or a whisper that pauses just before it becomes a word. Its doors were always closed, but never locked, and when you opened them, carefully, reverently, you found the same collection inside, shelves lined with small glass bottles, each no larger than your palm, and each filled with a different shade of something you could never quite name. They were not labeled in the usual sense. Some bore curling script etched into the glass itself, others had faded parchment tied with silver thread, and a few had nothing but a symbol, a crescent, a circle, a hand drawn in ash. You would touch them only with the tips of your fingers, and even then, sparingly. Some felt cold, as if they had been taken from a riverbed moments ago. Others were warm, not with heat, but with the gentle hum of something once alive, now sleeping. You remember how the light would pass through the colored glass at certain hours of day, especially near sunset, and scatter across the corridor walls in long, trembling patterns, like forgotten music made visible. There was a deep blue vial that smelled of winter, not just the chill, but the memory of frost on pine and the way breath curls in the air when everything else is still. Another, the color of rusted gold, released the faint scent of oranges and salt-like distant markets by the sea. A pale, violet one seemed to hold nothing at all, yet when you held it near your ear, it sang the faintest note, as soft and round as sleep. You never opened them, you never dared. Somehow, even as a child, you understood they were not made for use in the way common things are used. They were keepsakes of something unseen, containers for more than liquid, memory, perhaps, or thought, distilled and preserved, or simply silence, caught at the perfect moment and saved in glass. Once, you saw the alchemist there, not during one of his deep hours of solitude, but in a moment so brief it still feels half invisible. He was kneeling before the cupboard, one hand resting lightly on the bottom shelf, the other cupping a bottle of palest green, almost clear, like rainwater gathered on a cool leaf. He didn't look at you, but he knew you were there, and with a nod that was neither invitation nor refusal, he stood, slid the bottle back into its place, and left without a sound. The scent lingered behind him, sweet, like wood smoke and pear sand. The light through the glass shimmered just a little longer that day. After he vanished, the cupboard was never emptied. The housekeeper once mentioned clearing it, but her voice faltered as she spoke, and she said no more. The doors remained closed, the bottles untouched, yet they continued to catch the light in the evenings, glowing softly along the corridor like a quiet procession of stars. You would still visit sometimes, when the house had settled into the hush between dinner and dreams, and you would sit on the floor nearby, not looking at the cupboard directly, but letting the glimmers dance along your hands, your legs, the folds of your robe, as though the bottles still remembered you and had something left to share. The corridor itself aged around them, dust gathering in the floor's grooves, the plaster on the far wall peeling ever so slightly in the corners, but the cupboard and its contents remained unchanged, like a breath held between lifetimes. On rare occasions, you'd hear a soft sound from within, a faint clink, perhaps, or a shift, like one bottle leaning gently against another, in the quiet, but no one else ever seemed to notice. And when you listened more closely, there was only silence. Years passed, and with them came renovations, removals, and reimaginings in other parts of the house. Rooms were painted, windows were replaced. The east garden became a fountain, but the west wing was left untouched, as though bound by a kind of gentle agreement that whatever was there ought to remain as it was. And so the cupboard stayed, with its glass vials, and its soft glows, and its silence, becoming part of the architecture of memory, rather than function in alcove for what was once possible, and what still might be, in the minds of those willing to sit quietly long enough to wonder. Even now, when you return in dreams, or in the echoing quiet of thought, you find yourself there again, kneeling before that same cupboard. The bottles still gleam in their scattered arrangement, their contents neither spoiled nor forgotten. One seems to have changed color slightly, another now reflects the candlelight more brightly than you remember. You reach out, as always, and stop just short of touching. The cupboard is not asking to be opened, nor is it asking to be left alone. It simply is, like the hush that comes before sleep, or the way starlight lingers on water long after the moon has moved on. And so, the bottles remain where he left them, quietly catching the light and holding it, as if to say, this too is part of the story. A chapter without words, a memory without sound. Another small reason why the alchemist's room was never opened again. It hung just outside the alchemist's door, suspended from an iron hook that curled like the stem of a withered vine. So old and weather-worn, it had fused slightly into the stone with the long passage of time. You remember it clearly, not because it was grand or remarkable, but because it was always lit, even when the rest of the house fell into darkness. While other lanterns sputtered out with the last breath of the night wind, or were forgotten by sleepy hands and left to burn out on their own, this one glowed with a steady, unwavering flame that flickered only when you breathed too close, or when the corridor itself exhaled in its ancient, shifting way. The lantern was small, made of darkened brass, and 4 panels of thick, wavy glass. Each corner etched faintly with curling lines that might have once been symbols or simply patterns of light. The handle was twisted, like the neck of a bird mid-turn, and when the light passed through the glass, it cast a dappled gold upon the walls and floor, pooling in soft circles, like liquid sunlight held in place by silence. No one ever cleaned it, and yet there was no soot, no dust, no oil stain darkening the stone below. The flame within did not smoke, or pop, or change size. It simply was, quiet, constant, and strange, in a way that never demanded attention, but always drew your eyes when you passed. You used to pause there sometimes, when the hall was empty and the windows were dim, and press your hand to the warmth that radiated outward, not hot, never burning, but soothing, like the warmth of someone else's coat left hanging near the hearth. It felt alive, in a quiet way, the way a stone feels after being held, or how pages smell just after being turned. You wondered what fed the flame, what oil or wick or mechanism could keep it alight through rainstorms and winters and all the slow unravelings of time. But you never asked, and no one ever explained. The housekeeper only said, once and softly, that the lantern had been lit since before she came to the house, and she would never dare snuff it, not even in jest. Some nights, when you couldn't sleep, you would sit at the far end of the corridor, where the light just barely touched the tip of your foot, and you would watch the shadows it made stretch and dance against the walls. Lone, slow-moving echoes that shifted with the softness of dreams. It never made you afraid. On the contrary, the glow made you feel held somehow, as if the alchemist had left a piece of himself behind, not locked in the room, but watching over it from just outside, in the tender hush of that golden flame. There was an evening, you recall, when the storm winds howled through the valleys, and the shutters, all throughout the manor, banged and rattled like bones shaken in old wood. The hearths were doused, candles extinguished in gusts of wind that slipped through the cracks and seams of the old house. But when you crept down the hallway, barefoot and wrapped in a quilt, the lantern still burned, serene and undisturbed, its light casting calm against the chaos beyond the stone walls. You remember sitting beneath it, knees drawn to your chest, letting the warmth ease its way into your skin, into your breath, until the storm no longer felt like something trying to enter, but merely a wild voice passing by, uninterested in the quiet that lived there. Even after the alchemist vanished, no one touched the lantern. It was never cleaned, never refilled, never discussed beyond murmured wonder. Generations of house staff passed by it daily, their steps softening with age, their hair silvering like frost, but none of them laid claim to it. Even when the wall around it was repainted, the lantern was left alone, masked carefully with cloth and reverence, as though disturbing it might awaken something not meant to stir. And so it remained, glowing softly year after year. The last living sign of his presence, a flame that remembered what everyone else had begun to forget. Sometimes you imagined the alchemist returning in the quietest hours, stepping through the hall unseen, his shadow flickering against the walls as the lantern welcomed him home. Not as a ghost, not as a specter, but as something softer memory shaped like a man, passing through the warmth of his own absence. You would see it in your dreams, now and then, always in the same way. The hallway dim and dusted with silence, the door unchanged, and the lantern burning, not brighter, not dimmer, but exactly as it always was waiting. There was never any attempt to replace it, even when newer fixtures came to the house, polished and wired and made to glow with predictable electric promise. The lantern remained untouched, a constant beside a door that no longer opened, beneath a hook that no longer creaked, above a floor that bore no prints. It was a kind of marker not of what had ended, but of what had never quite gone away. A soft punctuation in the sentence of the corridor, reminding you with every flicker that there are some flames too old to be named, too gentle to be feared, too alive to be extinguished. And now, long after the hall has grown more silent, long after the wallpaper has faded to pale shadow, and the air has thickened with the hush of forgotten footsteps, the lantern still glows. No one tends it, no one feeds it, but it does not go out. Even when all other lights are gone, that one remains, as if the very walls remember the hand that lit it, and cannot bear to let it go dark. You think of it sometimes when you're far away, when the night is cold and the sky empty, and in your mind the corridor returns, not as a place, but as a feeling. That warm, golden glow, steady in the silence, watching, waiting, never changing. And that, too, you understand now, is part of why the alchemist's room was never opened again. It was in the library that you found it, long after you had stopped searching, and even longer after you had given up believing there was anything left to find. The air in that part of the house was always cooler, thick with the scent of old paper and the faint, ghostly sweetness of polished wood. Dust floated slowly in long shafts of window light, soft as breath, undisturbed by time or footsteps. The shelves bowed gently under the weight of their volumes, and the books leaned into one another like companions grown old together. There was a stillness in the room that you had always found comforting, a silence not of emptiness, but of listening, a place where thought was allowed to settle, to breathe, to unfold. You had wandered there with no purpose that afternoon, drawn by the hush, by the feel of thick rugs underfoot, by the sun resting drowsily across the high-backed chairs. And as you passed the long table beneath the west window, you noticed the paper. It had not been there the day before. If it had hidden itself well, tucked into shadow, or lost among the clutter of other things too long untouched. But now it sat alone near the edge, folded not in half or into quarters, but into a precise, impossible shape, a soft spiral that curved like a sleeping fern, so intricately wound that it could not have held that form by accident. No hands had creased it recently. There was no wax seal, no ink, no ribbon, just the paper, pale and fine and humming faintly with the kind of presence that makes you slow your breath without knowing why. You reached for it carefully, letting your fingers hover before committing to the touch, and as you did, you noticed the temperature shift just slightly. The air around the paper was warmer, scented faintly with something sweet and distant, honeycomb, perhaps, or a candle long extinguished but still fragrant at the wick. When your skin finally met the surface, the paper did not resist, nor did it unfold completely. It shifted, softly, like something asleep being gently stirred, and as you watched, it began to unfurl, not abruptly, not like a trick of the eye, but slowly, deliberately, as though it remembered how to open, only after being touched by someone who remembered the alchemist. The spiral released itself with a series of delicate movements, each one a breath long, until it lay flat before you, perfectly uncreased, impossibly smooth. There was no writing on it, no drawing, no mark you could name. But the surface shimmered faintly, and when you tilted it toward the light, you could just make out patterns hidden in the grain circles within circles. Some expanding, others collapsing inward, like echoes caught in motion, or raindrops on mirrored glass. You traced one gently with your fingertip and felt something behind your ribs loosen, like the quiet unraveling of an old question, or the moment just before a forgotten name returns to your lips. You didn't show it to anyone. You didn't speak of it, not even in whisper. You simply placed it back on the table, though it did not fold itself again, and you let it rest there, untouched, for many days after. Sometimes you returned and sat across from it, watching the light change upon its surface, noticing how the patterns shifted when the wind stirred the curtains, how the faintest draft from the hallway would ripple the paper ever so slightly, like a sigh. You came to think of it not as a message, but as a presence, one that didn't speak but listened, didn't instruct but reminded. The others in the house never seemed to notice it. The librarian dusted around it, never lifting it, never remarking on its origin. Visitors passed it without a glance. Even the cat, curious as it was with other things, walked around it in a perfect circle, tail lowered and silent. And so it remained part of the room, yet never entirely of it, much like the alchemist himself, who had once frequented the library in the quiet hours of the morning. His footsteps, so soft, you only knew he was near by the scent of cloves or the faint rustle of a page being turned. There were moments, as you sat beside it, when you thought you heard something faint chimes, or the whisper of wind through reeds, or a voice speaking in a language you knew once, but forgot in the growing. The sound was never direct, never clear, but it resonated gently in your bones, like the memory of music after the notes have ended. You found yourself thinking differently near the paper, your thoughts slower, more spacious, as if time itself softened in its presence. You would stay there for hours without meaning to, blinking at the dusk that gathered while you weren't watching, feeling as though you had been elsewhere, though you had never moved. And then one morning it was gone, not taken, not stolen, simply absent, as though it had never been. The surface of the table bore no mark, no dustless ring, no trace of warmth. You stood there for a long while, one hand resting where it had lain, expecting something to return, a shimmer, a scent, a soft fold, but nothing came. Only the light, moving across the bookshelves, and the quiet, holding its breath. You searched gently, not with panic, but with the sadness of having lost a dream just before waking. You never found it again. And yet, sometimes, in other places, you would come across the feeling of it, the curl of steam rising from a cup, the spiral of a snail's shell in the garden, the pattern in the frost on the edge of the window, and you would remember the way it felt to sit near something that asked nothing of you, only your stillness, only your presence. It was not a clue, not a puzzle, not a map to open the alchemist's room, but it was a part of him, a quiet remainder, a paper that folded itself not to be read, but to be remembered. And that is why, even now, when the door remains closed, and the lantern continues to glow, and the bottles sleep in their cupboard, and the garden drifts with thyme and ivy, you know deep within that there is nothing behind that door that needs to be uncovered. The alchemist left enough traces outside for those who knew how to see. That paper was one of them, a breath of thought, a spiral of silence. One more reason why the alchemist's room was never opened again. There was a small bronze bell above the window on the third floor, just beneath the gable, where the roof sloped into a narrow peak that only birds and wandering clouds ever truly noticed. It had no rope, no clapper visible from below, and no pulley attached to summon its sound. It hung from a length of weathered iron that had darkened to a soft brown-green over the years, and its surface bore the patina of rain and time, dappled with faint verdigris and the pale sheen that coppered metal takes on when it forgets how long it has lived. You didn't know who had placed it there, nor did anyone else, and yet you remember it clearly, as though it had always been part of the house's quiet language, like the creak of the stairs or the hush of wind curling down the corridor. It was the kind of detail one overlooks at first, noticed only in the moment between glances, caught in the corner of the eye while watching swallows stitch the sky with their quiet arcs. But once seen, it stayed with you. It was not large, smaller than your palm, if you ever dared to reach it, but perfectly formed, its shape balanced, its presence discreet. And though you could not explain why, you always felt that it belonged to the alchemist. Not just in location above, the long narrow window that faced the western woods, but in essence, as though its very being had been shaped by his breath, his thoughts, the soft cadence of his solitude. The bell never rang in the usual sense. It did not call out through thunder or break the silence of early morning fog. Its music was not for ears, not precisely. You heard it once, or thought you did, in the soft violet hours just before dawn, when mist had gathered across the lawn and the air smelled faintly of chamomile and coal smoke. It wasn't a sound that startled, but something that curled through the spine, like a memory long buried, or the feeling of someone reading a letter you'd never written. You paused beneath the window, then, bare feet pressing into the cold flagstone floor, and listened as the tone faded into the walls and settled somewhere behind your ribs, like a breath held too long. The others in the house did not speak of it, not even in jest. Some may have noticed it, standing in the courtyard or watching the doves rise in the late morning sun. But no one acknowledged its presence aloud. Perhaps they were wary, or simply unsure. But you returned to it, often drawn by its silence. The weight of its shadow cast long across the roof in late afternoon. The way the light caught on its edge, just as the sun passed over the far hills and left the world softened in gold and ash. You began to mark its patterns, the way it glimmered just before dusk, or the stillness that gathered around it in rain, or the curious, almost imperceptible vibration in the glass of the window below when you stood very close and pressed your fingers gently to the sill. Once, during a late summer storm, you opened that window. The rain had slowed to a hush of droplets, barely more than breath, and the trees beyond swayed as if whispering to one another in sleep. The wind stirred the hem of your nightrobe and lifted the scent of wet stone and moss into the air, and then, so soft, it might have been the echo of your own thought. The bell moved. It didn't chime not in the traditional sense, but it shimmered with a resonance that passed not through the ears but through the skin, a subtle vibration that lingered in the marrow, like the hum of something vast and ancient passing nearby, unseen but not unfelt. You closed the window slowly, your fingers damp from the sill, and stood in silence for a long while afterward, listening to the quiet, to the soft hush of your own breath in the stillness, to the way the bell's presence now seemed to fill the room like light that had forgotten where it came from. It occurred to you then that perhaps the bell was not meant to ring for people. Perhaps it rang for the house itself, for the stones, the timbers, the sleeping walls, or for the alchemist, wherever he had gone, as a signal or a reminder or a whisper that something still waited for him here. There were no strings, no triggers you could find, no sign that the bell was ever touched by wind or hand. And yet you came to believe that it had its own understanding of when to speak and when to remain silent. And the times you thought you felt it, even if only faintly, sudden hush in the room, a flicker of shadow, a warmth at the base of your neck, you always paused and looked toward the window, knowing without knowing that something had shifted, not in the world, perhaps, but in you, or in the air between your breath and the walls that held it. Years later, when the house grew quieter and fewer voices passed through its halls, the bell remained. It did not rust, it did not fall. Birds no longer nested near it, as if aware of some boundary they dared not cross. Even the ivy, bold in other corners of the manor, curled gently away from the narrow frame beneath it. You visited it less, but never forgot. Sometimes you would catch the scent of rain, even on dry days, or feel a note in the air that made you turn, certain you had just missed something, a whisper, a footstep, a bell, but nothing would be there. And now, when you close your eyes and picture the alchemist's room, it is not the door you see first, nor the lantern or the bottles, or the paper that folded itself, is that small, suspended bell, caught forever between motion and stillness. Watching the light change across the rooftops and listening to the silence that stretches softly into time. Whatever was sealed within the room beyond, it never asked to be opened. It had its own ways of speaking, of reaching, of remembering. And the bell, silent though it may seem, was one of them. That is why, when you walk the upper corridors in dream or in thought, and the window above you catches the golden tilt of evening, you always pause beneath the bell. You do not wait for it to ring. You simply listen, and in that listening, you understand, once again, why the alchemist's room was never opened again. It was in the alcove at the far end of the library wing, just beyond the shelves, where the books had no titles and the dust fell like memory, that you once found the jar. Not a grand jar, nor one with the ornate flourishes of gold or etched glass, but a humble, round-lidded vessel of thick, slightly bubbled crystal, the kind one might use to store dried lavender or tea leaves, or perhaps a scoop of sugar for stormy days. And yet, when you cupped it in your hands, you knew at once that it held something far more delicate, something that did not belong to the pantry or the hearth or the well-thumbed ledgers of kitchen-keeping, but to the in-between, the space where things are not quite invisible, only forgotten. The jar was cool to the touch, as if it had never known sunlight, and when you lifted it, you could feel the faintest tremble, a slow ripple inside, as though air moved like water within it. There was no label, no wax seal, no curious sigil carved into the lid, only the faint shimmer of something silver just beneath the surface, impossible to describe. And yet you knew in your marrow that it was light, not sunlight, nor candlelight, nor the kind of glow that drips from chandeliers in ballroom evenings. This was quieter, colder, purer, the kind of light you might glimpse for only a heartbeat at the very end of a snow-covered lane in deep winter, just as the last breath of dusk exhales into the bones of the land. You turned the jar slowly in your palms, and it moved with the grace of breath held in a sleeping lung. The light inside did not flicker, but shifted softly, like snowflakes dancing in the hush just before midnight. It was neither bright nor dim, but settled somewhere deep and secret, as if it were not meant to be seen, only remembered. You did not open it, somehow you knew you must not, like the feeling of standing beside a sleeping child, or watching the last candle go out in a chapel where no one has prayed for years. The alcove itself had always been a place of pause, a gentle hush in the corner of the house where time wore slippers and spoke in whispers. The walls were paneled in pale wood that had darkened with age, and above the high window, ivy had grown so thick it filtered every shaft of daylight into a greenish hush, like light remembered through glass at the bottom of a pond. There was a small chair tucked beneath the sill, the cushion worn smooth by years of stillness, and you would often sit there with the jar resting in your lap, not to study it or solve it or claim it, but simply to be near it, as one might sit beside an old friend and watch the rain. There was a companionship in its quiet, a kind of peace that made you feel you had stepped out of the flow of hours and into something deeper, more ancient, and far less hurried. Occasionally, when the afternoon had grown long and the wind pressed its breath against the leaded panes, you imagined that the jar hummed faintly, not a sound exactly, but a feeling that passed through the spine and settled into the soft place behind your heart. It felt like winter, but not the harsh kind more like the memory of walking across snow that has not yet been touched by another's foot, or the way your breath curls in the air when everything around you is still and listening. And always, when you held it, you thought of the alchemist not with fear or mystery, but with that quiet ache one feels for someone who was never quite of this world, but who lived in it anyway, carefully, quietly, and left behind something too gentle to be spoken of in full voice. No one else in the house seemed to notice the jar, or if they did, they never mentioned it. It remained there year after year, untouched except by you, its light unchanged, its silence undisturbed. You began to wonder if it had always been there, even before your time, waiting in that corner, like a small, sleeping flame that refused to go out. It felt less like an object, and more like a vow, something he had promised to hold on to. And then, perhaps knowing he could not keep it, sealed away in the hope that someone, someday, would simply sit beside it and remember. Sometimes, in the earliest blue hours before dawn, when you woke with that strange sense that something had moved in your dreams but left no mark upon your waking mind, you would slip through the corridor, past the unlit sconces and the curtain that never quite stayed drawn, and find your way to the alcove. The jar would be there, waiting, its glow soft and steady, casting long, whisper-thin shadows across the floorboards. And in those moments, you did not feel alone. You did not feel lost. You felt as though the house breathed with you, and through the walls, something very old and very kind was watching over you. You never told anyone what you thought the jar truly was, not because it was a secret, but because it was a feeling, and feelings, like the light it held, are not always meant to be poured into language. But you came to believe that the alchemist, for all his strange and quiet ways, had loved something deeply, perhaps a season, perhaps a silence, perhaps the bare beauty of light caught in froststand, that he had captured it, not to possess it, but to preserve it. And in that small act of preservation, he had offered the world a kindness too delicate for most to notice. Now, when you think of the room that no one enters, you do not think of locked doors or buried secrets or spells woven into the floorboards. You think of that little jar, resting in a shaft of shadowed light, still and silent and full of winter. You think of the way it felt in your hands, cool, gentle, alive, and you understand, as if the knowledge had always been folded beneath your ribs, why the alchemist's room was never opened again. Because sometimes what is most sacred is not what we hide, but what we choose simply to hold. There is a cupboard in the house, not grand or gilded, but plain and dark and tall, tucked beneath the curling stair that leads nowhere anyone ever goes. You only ever opened it once, and you did not do so with intention, but with the slow, meandering curiosity that comes in quiet hours, when your hands move without thinking, and the world, hushed and golden with afternoon, seems to guide you gently toward forgotten corners. The handle was small and smooth, worn soft by years of turning, and when the door creaked open, it smelled of dried mint, candle wax, and the faint sweetness of things that have not been touched for a long time. Inside, there were shelves lined with oddities, a small brass scale with one side heavier than the other, a stack of folded linens yellowed with time, a lantern with no wick, and beneath it all, nestled in a shallow wooden drawer that slid out with a whisper, a single porcelain teacup wrapped in faded silk. The cup was delicate, lighter than air in your palm, and though its rim was chipped in one place and the glaze had faded to a pale ghost of its former color, it held something that made you still, as if your breath had paused to listen. Painted across its curve was a scene not of flowers or vines or golden birds, but of fog-soft, silver-gray fog rising between faint outlines of trees, the kind of forest one only walks through in dreams. There was no signature, no maker's mark, only that fine swirl of mist and the strange, gentle stillness it conjured. You turned the cup slowly, marveling at how the fog seemed to move as the light struck the porcelain, as if whatever painter had made it had somehow trapped motion in glaze. It did not feel like decoration. It felt like memory, like the feeling of walking home through an early morning where everything is hushed, dullest, and the world has not yet fully woken. You remembered mornings like that from long ago, ones you thought had dissolved into the folds of time, and yet here they were, alive in the bowl of this forgotten cup. You did not ask who had painted it. No one in the house would have known, and even if they had, their words might have broken the spell. Some things are not meant to be explained, but only understood in silence, in the way a hand rests against a cool stone wall, or a shadow moves across old floorboards. You held the cup for a long time, seated on the lowest stair, where the light from the narrow window painted golden stripes on your knees. The warmth of the day touched your skin, but the porcelain stayed cool, as if it remembered the fog it carried, and would not be changed by sun or time or hands. Later, you would return to that drawer again and again, never taking the cup far, never pouring anything into it, never disturbing the silk that cradled it too long. You simply opened the cupboard, felt the gentle hush slip over your shoulders, and held the cup in your palms like a small, sleeping creature. And every time, the fog would greet you anew, shifting slightly, not in the image itself, but in your heart, which seemed to find new pathways through the trees each time your gaze wandered there. There were evenings when you would imagine the alchemist seated in that same place, one hand curled around the porcelain, the other tracing notes in a book that no longer existed. Perhaps the fog on the cup had come from something he remembered, a journey taken not by foot, but by soul through lands of mist and thought and twilight, where nothing had edges and everything shimmered like the breath of stories told between candle flames. You imagined him quiet, not lonely, surrounded by the silence he had shaped to his liking, sipping something that did not steam, from a cup that held not liquid but memory. And then you wondered too, if the cup had not been his at all, but a gift perhaps from someone who had walked with him for a time, someone who knew how to paint fog with such tenderness that it became a place to return to. Maybe that person had long since disappeared into the mists they painted, and the alchemist, unable to let them go entirely, kept the cup as a way to hold them in his days. There was a softness to the thought that made your eyes sting, not with sorrow, but with something older a kindness for all the quiet loves the world forgets. There is something sacred about small things left behind, not the grand artifacts of power or invention, but the little objects worn by time and touched by a teacup, a ribbon, a page folded just so. They whisper stories that cannot be spoken aloud, and you learn to listen with more than ears. That is how it was with the cup. You never sought to know more than it would offer, never tried to unravel its truth like a thread. You simply accepted it, as one accepts the turning of seasons, or the silence after snowfall. Now, When you pass the stair and see the cupboard standing quietly in its place, you sometimes pause, fingers brushing the handle not to open it, but just to feel its curve. You know the cup is still there, resting in its silk, painting its fog in the dark. And though you have not held it in some time, you carry it with you, not in your hands, but in the way your breath slows when morning mists curl across the fields, or how your thoughts drift when the evening is too quiet to hold shape. And so the alchemist remains not just in his room, but in these gentle echoes: a cup in a cupboard, a fog in a glaze, a memory so delicate it can only be seen when you are very still. You understand now that some rooms are never reopened, not because they are feared, but because they are complete. They have given all they were meant to give, and what remains is a hush, a reverence, a lingering thread of breath in porcelain. There was once a night, or at least the memory of a night, when the stars above the old house did not follow their ancient paths. You remember it not as a strange event, but as something beautifully out of step with time, like a note held just a little longer in a lullaby. It began as all evenings did, then with the slow curling of shadows through the hallway, the soft dimming of color, until everything turned to silver and quiet blue. The garden beyond the windows had gone still, save for the rustle of hedges brushed by wind too gentle to disturb the petals, and the trees leaned inward, their limbs holding the hush-like cupped hands. You had lit a single candle in the corridor, and its flame moved like breath, small, warm, flickering as if whispering secrets to the night. The floor beneath your feet had been cool and smooth, worn soft by many years of passage, and the scent that rose from the walls was faintly of dried flowers, perhaps lavender, or maybe something older, something alchemical that no longer grew but once had. You wandered as you often did then, slowly, not seeking anything, only feeling the house around you like an old song you didn't need to understand to follow. It was a habit of yours to look up at the sky through the round glass window in the upper hallway, where vines had curled outside long ago, framing the stars with delicate tendrils. That night, you climbed the steps in a hush, candle in hand, expecting to see the familiar slow turning of constellations across the heavens, but they were still, not hidden, not dimmed, but motionless, as if the great wheel of the sky had stopped, caught in breathless wonder, and decided to stay there, unmoving, just for a while. You leaned closer to the glass, breath fogging its surface, and looked for some sign of the night continuing, perhaps a drifting cloud, or a flicker of something falling, but there was only stillness, perfect and soft and vast. It was not frightening, it was quieting, like someone had pressed a gentle hand against the sky and asked it to be still, just for now, just for the length of a thought. In that moment, the candle did not flicker, and the house did not creak. Even the air held itself like a secret waiting to be kept. You remember that you did not move either, standing there at the window, eyes reflecting starlight that no longer traveled, and somewhere deep in the house, past the door that had long remained closed, past the faded tapestries and the soft dust that lay like a silken veil across everything, you felt it again, that presence, not of someone living exactly, but of someone remembering as you remembered, a thought echoing through walls that had learned how to listen. Perhaps it had been the alchemist himself who had wished the stars to pause. Perhaps there had been a night, years before you were born, when he had asked the sky for a moment more, one final hour, to hold something precious before time carried it beyond reach. You imagined him seated in his room of amber bottles and folded parchment, tracing the paths of the heavens with ink-stained fingers, watching as the great wheel slowed at his request. Or maybe it was never a question of asking, but simply of being so still, so deeply attuned to the pulse of things, that the stars paused out of reverence, offering him what they had never offered anyone else: stillness without end. They said the constellations over the roof had twisted into new shapes, ones not marked in any chart, and that time itself bent slightly when it passed through those stones. But you never cared for those stories, because what you had seen was not grand or strange. It was gentle, it was subtle, it was a hush the size of the sky. Eventually, you returned to your room. The stars were still unmoving as you descended the stairs, candlelight brushing your shoulders like a warm shawl. The floor felt the same beneath your feet, and yet something in your chest had softened, as if your heart had understood something it could not put into words. That night, you slept without dreams, wrapped in the feeling that time had folded around you like a cloak, not to trap you, but to keep you safe. And in the days that followed, when the stars resumed their movement, and the candle smoke curled as usual through the evening air, you did not tell anyone what you had seen. You didn't need to. It wasn't a story to be spoken. It was a memory that lived in the light between things, in the quiet hush before sunrise, or the shimmer of frost on windows, or the way dust hangs in sunbeams just before it settles. It stayed with you, not as something that had happened, but as something that had always been. You sometimes wonder, now, if the stars were ever moving at all, or if that was simply how the world had chosen to appear when the alchemist walked through its low, measured, eternal in its unfolding. Maybe his room had never needed to be opened again, because it still existed in that stillness, untouched by the rhythm of clocks or the tolling of bells. Maybe what you witnessed that night wasn't the halting of the stars, but the glimpse of a truth the rest of the world had forgotten: that time, like magic, responds to gentleness, to patience, to quiet love. And so, even now, when the night stretches long and the stars wheel slowly overhead, you sometimes find yourself returning to that memory, not to analyze or explain, but simply to feel, to be in the presence of stillness again, to know that once, just once, the stars paused and the world listened, and something deeper than time passed softly through the house and never quite left. There was a time when you found yourself lingering in the study, drawn by the subtle scent that settled between the shelves, a scent that was neither quite dust nor quite parchment, but something older, something soft and lingering like a sigh pressed between the pages of an ancient book. The room was bathed in the golden wash of late afternoon light, the kind that slips through the latticed windows in gentle beams, warming the faded spines of leather-bound tomes, and setting the dust to dance in slow spirals that seemed to float without weight or urgency. You breathed it in a mingling of worn paper, beeswax from half-melted candles, and a faint whisper of herbs long since dried on. Felt yourself folding into that quiet world, where time unraveled slowly and memories tucked themselves like secrets in the margins. In the corner of the room, resting on a low wooden desk, scarred by the passage of many hands, was a stack of papers tied with a thin ribbon, now frayed at the edges, its color faded to the softest gray. The paper itself was delicate, almost translucent in places, as if the alchemist's very thoughts had worn them thin with repetition. You untied the ribbon slowly, careful not to disturb the fragile bundle, and lifted the top sheet with reverence. It was a page filled with the gentle curve of ink strokes notes, written in a hand both careful and tender. The kind of handwriting that seems to carry the shape of the writer's breath and heartbeat. As you traced the letters with your fingertips, feeling the roughness of the parchment beneath your skin, you could almost hear the quiet scratching of quill against paper, the soft tap of ink droplets landing in rhythm with the alchemist's thinking. The words were not meant for you, not exactly, but you read them anyway, as though the pages had invited you into their hush. They spoke of stars and minerals, of light caught in crystal, of moments stretched between dusk and dawn. Yet beneath the scholarly notes, there was something else, a current of feeling, like the underside of a melody or the warmth of a hand held just a little longer than needed. You folded the page back gently and allowed the stack to settle in your palms, the weight of it more than just paper, but a kind of presence, quiet and steady, like a companion waiting in the fading light. You imagined the alchemist sitting at this very desk, candlelight flickering on his face, tracing these lines with a thoughtful gaze, his mind wandering through the corridors of thought and wonder. Perhaps he wrote not just to understand the world, but to speak to something unseen, something too delicate to be spoken aloud, an echo of the soul hidden in the folds of science and mystery. The room held its silence like a breath held in trust, the soft creak of floorboards outside barely stirring the stillness within. You felt the pulse of time slow, as though the house itself leaned in to listen, to remember. The air was cool and dry, touched by the faint aroma of jasmine tea left to steep and grow quiet on the windowsill. Light waned further, stretching shadows long and soft across the desk. But you stayed there, savoring the way the alchemist's words seemed to ripple through the space, weaving a quiet thread between past and present, between the room that no one dared open and the hearts that carried its story. It was in that gentle space that you understood something fragile and true, that the alchemist's room was never opened again, not because it held danger or secrets meant to be locked away, but because it held a memory too precious for the world to disturb. It was a place where thoughts could rest, where the fragile dance of wonder and solitude was preserved like the light held captive in a crystal, or the soft fog painted on a porcelain cup. Some things, you realized, are not meant for the touch of curious hands, but for the quiet reverence of those who carry their echoes softly within. And so, as the evening deepened and the house settled into its own slow breathing, you stood and untied the ribbon once more, replacing the papers with care, leaving the study wrapped in the hush of old ink and whispered dreams. You closed the door gently behind you, and the scent of old paper lingered like a promise, a soft invitation to remember always, to remember that some rooms are best left untouched, their stories unfolding not in the light of day, but in the quiet chambers of the heart, where memory dwells and time bends just enough to hold what we love. There is a door, tucked just beyond the winding staircase, where the walls bend with the weight of years, and the air carries a quiet stillness like the pause between heartbeats. Before that door, a velvet curtain hangs, its color faded from one's deep burgundy to a soft whisper of rose, and its surface worn thin where countless fingers have brushed it, whether in passing or lingering thought. You remember the texture beneath your fingertips, the way the fibers, though frail and threadbare, still held a faint warmth, as if the curtain itself had absorbed countless sunsets and quiet breaths, storing them in folds that caught the light with gentle hesitation. The curtain does not move with the wind, nor does it billow or stir like the others in the house, but rather hangs steady as though guarding something tender behind it. When you press your palm to its surface, you feel the softness of velvet worn to memory, cool but not cold, like the touch of an old friend whose presence is more felt than seen. Behind it, the door stands closed, its wood grain smooth beneath your hand, the iron latch steady but never undone. You do not know why the curtain was placed there, whether to shield the room from curious eyes, or to soften the silence that settled beyond, but you find comfort in its quiet presence, like a curtain drawn gently to keep the light from spilling too freely. You sometimes imagine the alchemist standing there years ago, fingers tracing the fabric before drawing it aside, revealing the space where his thoughts gathered and took shape. Perhaps he chose that curtain as a barrier between his world and the one outside, not to hide, but to protect what was fragile and precious, a sanctuary, where time bent softly and secrets were whispered only to the shadows. You feel, deep in the quiet of your bones, that the curtain and the door together were not meant to imprison, but to cradle, holding, save the delicate alchemy of solitude, of wonder, of a life lived between the known and the mysterious. The air near the curtain carries a scent you recognize, a faint trace of worn leather and dried herbs, mingled with something softer, like the lingering sweetness of vanilla and honey. It is the kind of fragrance that rises slowly in the warmth of the afternoon, curling around your senses and folding you into a space that feels timeless. When the sun sets low and the golden light spills in long shafts through the narrow windows, it brushes the curtain's folds, setting them aglow with a dusty rose warmth. And you watch the way the shadows play between the threads as if they were breathing. You have never drawn the curtain aside, though often your hand hesitates there, wanting to peek, wanting to know, and yet held back by a tenderness that is not quite fear, but a quiet reverence. There is something sacred about the unseen, something that invites patience and respect rather than discovery. Sometimes, you tell yourself, the most profound places are those left untouched, their stories carried in the soft folds of a curtain, in the spaces between breaths. And so, the curtain remains a veil between now and then, between the world that moves in sun and shadow, and the room that rests quietly beyond, where the alchemist once walked in thoughtful silence. It sways not with the breeze, but with memory, carrying the weight of all that was and all that remains, soft as a sigh, still as a moment held in time. When you think of the room that no one opened again, it is this curtain you see, first its threads worn thin by love, its color faded but glowing softly in the quiet light, a gentle guardian of the alchemist's lingering breath. Behind the house, just beyond the crumbling stone wall, covered in ivy and moss, there lies a garden that seems untouched by time's hurried hands. It is not a grand garden, with sculpted hedges or fountains gleaming beneath the sun, but a quiet, wild space where nature has been left to wander softly, weaving through forgotten paths and secret corners, like a slow, whispered song. You remember the way the air shifts there, the cool breath of shaded earth mingling with the faint, sweet scent of wildflowers and damp stone, and the soft rustle of leaves stirred by a breeze too gentle to disturb the stillness. The garden holds its own kind of light, a filtered, dappled glow that falls between branches and blooms, spilling onto mossy stones and petals with a softness that feels like a lullaby. You walk there barefoot once, feeling the tender brush of grass beneath your toes and the rough bark of trees leaning in close as if to share a secret. The soil smells rich and ancient, warm in the afternoon sun, yet cool beneath your touch, as if it remembers every step that has ever passed through it, every whispered word carried on the wind. Among the wild roses and ferns, you find small pockets of calm patches where the sunlight seems to gather, casting golden halos around clusters of forget-me-nots and delicate bluebells. The air is thick with the faintest hum of bees, and the distant call of a thrush blends with the sigh of the wind through the branches. Here, time slows, folding in on itself like a petal closing at dusk, and the garden feels less like a place and more like a gentle breath held between worlds. You sometimes imagine the alchemist wandering this garden, moving softly through the shade, his fingers brushing the leaves and flowers as if seeking answers in their quiet growth. Perhaps he came here to find balance, to listen to the language of earth and sky when the work within his room grew too heavy or too bright. There is a tenderness in the thought that he sought refuge, not just in potions or metals, but in the living things that bloom and fade without hurry, that follow their own rhythms without demand. The garden's beauty is not in perfection, but in its wildness, the way vines curl unexpectedly, and stones settle unevenly, and petals fall without ceremony. It is a place that does not ask to be tamed or understood, only to be witnessed with soft eyes and a patient heart. You learned, standing there in the quiet, that some things, like the garden, like the alchemist's room, are best left to their own pace, carrying their stories quietly beneath leaves and shadow. When the evening drapes its gentle veil over the world, the garden changes once more. The air cools, scented now with the crispness of approaching night and the subtle musk of earth settling into rest. The colors dim to muted shades, and the hum of life grows softer until only the faintest chorus of crickets remains. You often stay long after the light has faded, feeling the stillness settle around you like a shawl, and knowing that here, among the quiet wildness, something eternal breathes beneath the fading day. This garden, you understand, is part of the alchemist's gift, an unspoken offering of calm and space, a place where things can grow and wither unseen, where life moves with the grace of a slow, unfolding breath. It is a reminder that some rooms, some stories, are never truly closed. They live on in the spaces between stone and leaf, in the hush of twilight and the scent of wildflowers, waiting patiently to be remembered by those who listen with stillness and care. And so, when you think of why the alchemist's room was never opened again, you see not a locked door or a forbidden secret, but this garden, quiet and wild, stretching softly behind walls that keep their stories safe. You carry its calm with you, like a whispered promise, knowing that some things are held not in keys or hands, but in the gentle unfolding of time, in the quiet pulse of earth beneath the feet, and in the soft light that always returns after dusk. You have held the hourglass before, its slender shape resting lightly in your hands, the coolness of glass mingling with the warmth of the room, as if it held both time and memory suspended in its fragile curves. The sand within was pale, fine as the softest dust, and it fell not with haste but with a measured grace, drifting slowly through the narrow waist like a secret being whispered in slow motion. The hourglass was small enough to cradle, yet heavy with a weight far beyond its size. As though it contained more than grains of sand, perhaps the very passage of moments, delicate and fleeting, held captive in amber light. You remember the way the sunlight caught the glass one afternoon, sending gentle rainbows to dance softly across the worn wooden table, illuminating the particles of dust that floated like tiny stars in the still air. The room itself was hushed, wrapped in a kind of reverence that belonged not just to the object, but to the very idea of time passing without rush or clamor, moving quietly, patiently, as the world outside hurried on, unaware. You felt your breath slow, matching the rhythm of the falling sand. Each grain a gentle step in a dance too subtle for the ear but clear to the heart. The hourglass had belonged to the alchemist, or so the story went, a talisman of sorts, a reminder of the delicate balance between patience and change, between holding on and letting go. You imagine him sitting quietly by the window, watching the sand slip steadily, allowing the moments to unfold like petals, unhurried and full of light. Perhaps he saw in it the unfolding of his own days, each grain a thought, a breath, a small gesture of creation or reflection, falling steadily into the reservoir of memory. You ran your fingers over the smooth surface, feeling the faint warmth it held, as if the glass remembered the touch of those who had cradled it before you. There was a subtle scent nearby, the faint aroma of sandalwood mixed with dried lavender, a fragrance that seemed to rise from the shadows themselves, wrapping you in a calm embrace. The room hummed softly with the quiet music of dust motes swirling in shafts of late afternoon sun, the slow ticking of a distant clock barely audible, like the heartbeat of the house itself. Turning the hourglass over, you watched the sand begin its descent anew, slow and steady, a tiny cascade of time falling through the narrow middle, shaping moments into minutes with delicate precision. It was a gentle reminder that even in stillness, time flows, carrying with it all the quiet miracles of ordinary life, the soft unfolding of a leaf, the fading glow of twilight, the hush between one breath and the next. You felt yourself drawn into this slow movement, caught in the tender unfolding of something both ancient and new. Perhaps the alchemist held this hourglass as a meditation, a way to slow the world down when the weight of his work felt too heavy, when the boundaries between past and future blurred, and only the present moment remained true. You imagine the glass catching the light as he sat in thoughtful silence, the sand falling like a gentle melody, weaving through the quiet spaces of the room, filling the corners with a soft, luminous rhythm. In that silence, the alchemist may have found a refuge, a place where time was not a master, but a friend patient, unhurried, endlessly giving. And now, in the quiet of your own hands, the hourglass speaks to you in its own language of patience, of surrender, of the beauty found in moments that slip away like grains of sand, but leave behind something precious, a memory, a breath, a trace of light. You hold it gently, feeling the smoothness, the fragile strength, and you understand that some rooms, some stories, are never opened again, not out of fear or loss, but because they exist in these quiet things, in the slow fall of sand, in the soft gleam of glass, in the tender spaces where time unfolds with grace. As the light shifts and deepens, casting long shadows across the table, you turn the hourglass once more, and the sand begins its descent again, steady and calm, carrying you softly into the hush of night, where time moves not in haste but in gentle waves, cradled by the quiet melody of an endless hour. The glass itself was uneven, as if shaped by hand rather than machine, its imperfections catching the sunlight and fracturing it into scattered flecks of gold and amber, like tiny secret stars captured within the pane. You feel the warmth of that light on your skin even now, a tender embrace that lingers long after the sun has dipped below the horizon, fading gradually with the patient grace of twilight. The window framed a view not of grandeur, but of quiet beauty, glimpse of the garden where wildflowers bowed to the breeze, where ivy clung with gentle insistence to stone walls that knew the slow passage of seasons. Outside, the world seemed paused in a delicate balance between the soft sigh of leaves and the distant hum of life beyond the trees. Inside, the room breathed with the hush of things waiting for a moment that might never come. A moment held tenderly between shadow and light, between presence and absence. You could almost hear the soft scrape of the alchemist's hand as it traced the edges of the window frame, worn smooth by years of touch, each groove a silent story etched in wood and memory. The scent of beeswax and old parchment mingled with the faintest hint of rain, as if the sky outside had sighed its moisture onto the glass, leaving tiny droplets that shimmered like tears or forgotten dreams. The air was cool, but not cold, carrying the faint rustle of pages turning somewhere beyond sight, a sound as delicate as the brush of wings against a still morning. In that quiet room, where the fading light clung to surfaces like a soft whisper, time seemed to slow, folding gently around you. You might have sat by that window, candlelight flickering nearby, and watched as the day dissolved into evening, the amber hues deepening into richer golds and muted pinks, then finally melting into the deep blue hush of night. The window pane held all these moments, capturing their fragile beauty in its uneven glass, a silent witness to the alchemist's hours spent in contemplation and quiet labor. There is something profoundly soothing in that image, the way light and shadow meet and mingle, the way a single window can frame a whole world, both inside and out. Perhaps it was this sense of delicate balance that kept the alchemist's room closed, not because it was secret or forbidden, but because it was a space where time was held differently, more softly, more reverently. To open that door would be to disturb the gentle interplay of light and memory, to scatter the quiet moments held captive like fireflies in a glass jar. As the evening deepened and the stars began to kindle their distant fires in the sky, the light on the window pane faded completely, leaving behind only the cool reflection of shadows and the soft gleam of moonlight. You might have felt then, as you do now, that some rooms are never truly empty. They are filled with echoes of light and touch, with the slow heartbeat of moments too precious to release. The alchemist's room, with its fading window light and tender stillness, was such a placid, quiet sanctuary where the world's hurried pace fell away, leaving only the gentle rhythm of breath and the whisper of fading day. And so you leave the window, stepping back into the quiet hallways of the house, carrying with you the memory of that soft light, the way it lingered on the glass, warm and golden, just before the night claimed the sky. It is a memory to hold close, like a whispered lullaby, a gentle promise that even when the door remains closed, the light within is never truly gone. In the quiet folds of memory, you find yourself standing once more before the heavy door of the alchemist's room, the wood cool and worn beneath your fingers, the iron latch smooth from years of resting undisturbed. The air around you carries a faint echo of all that once was whispers of candlelight flickering. The soft hum of distant voices long faded, the delicate scent of herbs and parchment mingled with the faint, elusive trace of something like old rain on stone. It is a scent that lingers not only in the air, but in the very walls, as if the room itself breathes with a quiet life, holding its stories gently, waiting for a time when they might be heard again. You press your palm lightly to the door, feeling the grain beneath your skin, the subtle tremor of history held within that solid frame. There is no rush, no urgency in this moment, only a soft, abiding stillness that wraps around you like a shawl, comforting and familiar. The room beyond, though closed and silent, lives in the spaces between heartbeats, in the hush of evening shadows, in the slow dance of dust motes floating through shafts of fading light. It is a room that time forgot, not by accident, but by choice, a sanctuary for all that was delicate and precious, too tender to be disturbed. You imagine stepping inside, your footsteps softened by the thick, worn rug beneath your feet, the air warm but touched by a coolness that speaks of stone and quiet solitude. The faint glow of candlelight might still linger there, pooling in golden circles on the wooden table, scattered with glass vials and dried petals. The faint shimmer of metal tools catching the light like quiet jewels. You would breathe in deeply, tasting the mingled aromas of lavender and myrrh, honey and old books, each scent a thread woven into the fabric of memory. The alchemist's chair would be empty, but not abandoned, as if he had only just stepped away, leaving behind the echo of his presence, his thoughtful silence, his gentle hands moving slowly with purpose, the soft murmur of a whispered prayer or a half-remembered incantation. It is a space where science and spirit meet quietly, where knowledge is held with reverence and wonder, where every shadow and shimmer speaks of a world beyond the visible. And yet, you understand why the door remains closed. Not from fear, nor from secrecy, but because some rooms are not meant for many eyes or hurried footsteps. They are delicate spaces where time unfolds like a slow melody, where the past and present weave together in a dance too subtle to be disturbed by haste. To open the door would be to break the stillness, to scatter the soft light held there, to disturb the sacred balance that holds the room and all it contains safe from the world's restless hands. So you stand there, in the hush of twilight, carrying the room with you in your heart. It is a place of quiet beauty, a refuge for all that is gentle and true, a reminder that some stories live best not in spoken words or hurried deeds, but in the slow unfolding of memory and light. The alchemist's room was never opened again because it did not need to be. It lives on quietly, in the spaces between moments, in the soft breath of the evening air, in the lingering scent of dreams held close and never forgotten. And as you turn away, the door resting softly behind you, you carry with you a gentle truth that some doors are closed not to lock away secrets, but to keep safe the fragile, luminous heart of a story whispered on the breeze, waiting always to be remembered in the quiet calm of night.